In the heart of a neatly organized suburban HOA community, everything appeared carefully controlled. Lawns were trimmed to near perfection, mailboxes stood in identical alignment, and every house followed a similar color palette approved years ago by the Homeowners Association. To an outsider, it looked like the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever went wrong, where rules kept everything peaceful and predictable. But beneath that polished surface, life still carried quiet stories that most people never bothered to notice. One of those stories belonged to a man named Daniel Harris. Daniel was a disabled veteran who lived alone in a modest single-story home near the end of Oak Ridge Lane. He kept to himself most of the time. He wasn't unfriendly, just private. Neighbors would occasionally see him sitting on his porch in the early morning, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the world wake up in silence. There was something steady and distant about him, as if part of him still lived somewhere far away from suburban routines and HOA meetings. What most people did notice, however, was the flag. In his front yard stood a carefully maintained American flag on a sturdy pole. It wasn't flashy or oversized. It didn't have lights or decorations. It simply stood there, clean, respectful, and always properly folded at dusk. Beneath it was a small stone marker engraved with initials and dates, a quiet memorial to people who had served alongside him. Daniel never explained it unless someone asked directly, and even then, his answers were short and controlled, like someone trying not to reopen old doors. Most neighbors respected it. A few even felt a quiet sense of pride walking past it. But in an HOA community where rules were treated like law, not everyone saw things the same way. The Homeowners Association had always been strict, but recently it had become more active. New interpretations of community standards were being enforced more aggressively. Small violations were now receiving formal notices. Garden ornaments, porch decorations, even slightly uneven lawn edging had become reasons for warnings. Residents began to whisper that the HOA board was getting too serious, but few spoke up openly. Then came the newest board member. Linda Mitchell, who most residents would soon privately refer to as Karen, had moved into the neighborhood only a few months earlier. She carried herself with an air of authority that didn't quite match her newcomer status. She spoke in meetings with precision, always referencing bylaws and clauses as if she had memorized the entire HOA handbook. To her, rules weren't flexible suggestions. They were absolute standards meant to be enforced without exception. At first, her efforts seemed harmless enough. She issued reminders about trash bin placement and sent polite notices about driveway stains, but over time, her attention sharpened. She began walking the neighborhood more frequently, clipboard in hand, scanning homes like an inspector looking for faults invisible to everyone else. It wasn't long before her focus landed on Daniel Harris's property. To Linda, the flag stood out not because it was disrespectful, but because it didn't fit neatly into her interpretation of HOA uniformity. She questioned whether it complied with display regulations. She checked records. She cross-referenced guidelines. In her mind, it wasn't about the meaning of the flag, it was about whether it followed the exact written rules. Neighbors who overheard her comments felt uneasy but didn't intervene. Daniel was known, but not widely known, and HOA conflicts were something most people preferred to avoid. One quiet afternoon, Linda stopped in front of his house for a longer inspection than usual. She stood there staring at the flag for several moments, her expression unreadable. To her, it wasn't a memorial, it wasn't a tribute, it was simply another item that might be out of compliance. And that was the moment the first real tension of the neighborhood began to form, though no one fully realized it yet. Something was about to change on Oak Ridge Lane, and it would start with a flag no one thought would ever become a problem. Linda Mitchell didn't become Karen overnight in the eyes of the neighborhood, but she was quickly heading in that direction. Within weeks of joining the HOA board, she had transformed from a quiet newcomer into the most actively involved member in recent memory. While others treated HOA duties as occasional responsibilities, Linda treated them like a full-time mission. She kept printed copies of bylaws in her car, highlighted and tabbed. She quoted rules during casual conversations, and she rarely missed an opportunity to remind residents that consistency maintains property value. At first, some homeowners appreciated the attention. A few minor issues were resolved quickly because of her involvement: overflowing trash cans, broken fence panels, and overgrown hedges that had been ignored for months. But soon, people began to notice a shift. Linda wasn't just enforcing rules, she was searching for violations. She started walking the neighborhood at different times of day, sometimes early in the morning when most residents were still asleep, and sometimes late in the evening when porch lights flickered on. She carried a small tablet and took photos of anything that caught her attention. A crooked welcome mat, a slightly faded house number, a decorative wind chime that might not be HOA approved. Her reports to the board increased rapidly. Some neighbors found it annoying, others found it invasive, but most simply stayed quiet, hoping she wouldn't focus on them next. Then her attention returned to Daniel Harris's home. The flag had already been noted in passing during earlier discussions, but now it had become a formal item in Linda's documentation. She referenced a section in the HOA guidelines regarding external displays and uniform aesthetic standards. In her interpretation, the flag's placement and mounting did not fully align with the approved specifications. She raised the issue during a board meeting with calm confidence, as if presenting an objective fact rather than a sensitive concern. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them, an older resident named Mr. Collins, gently reminded her that flags, especially national flags, were often treated with special allowances and respect. Another member suggested that even if there was a technical issue, it might be better handled informally, given the homeowner's background. But Linda didn't soften her stance. "It doesn't matter who lives there," she said firmly. "If we start making exceptions, the rules lose meaning." The room went quiet after that. No one openly challenged her again. A week later, Linda decided to take action. She printed out a formal notice of violation. It cited vague language about non-standard display structure and visual inconsistency with community guidelines. It wasn't aggressive on paper, but its intent was clear. She personally walked it to Daniel Harris's home. Daniel was on his porch when she arrived. He noticed her approach immediately but didn't react strongly. He had the calm posture of someone who had dealt with far more serious situations than neighborhood complaints. Linda introduced herself in a brisk, professional tone and handed him the notice without much hesitation. Daniel read it slowly. There was a long pause. Then he looked up at her, not angry, not defensive, just steady. "It's a memorial flag," he said quietly. Linda nodded once, as if acknowledging the statement, but not its emotional weight. "I understand," she replied, "but HOA compliance isn't based on intent, it's based on standards." That sentence lingered in the air longer than either of them seemed to expect. Daniel didn't argue, he simply folded the notice carefully and held it in his hand. There was something in his silence that felt heavier than any raised voice could have been. Linda turned to leave, already mentally moving on to her next task. To her, this was just another enforcement action completed correctly, another rule upheld, another step toward maintaining order in the neighborhood she believed depended on structure. But as she walked away, she didn't notice the way a couple of nearby neighbors had quietly stepped out onto their porches, watching the interaction unfold. And she definitely didn't notice the subtle shift that had begun forming in the community's perception of her. Because from that moment forward, Daniel Harris's flag was no longer just a quiet memorial on a front lawn. It had become something else entirely in the eyes of Oak Ridge Lane. And Linda Mitchell had just placed herself directly in its path. The days after the notice did not bring resolution, they brought tension. Word travels quickly in a tightly packed HOA neighborhood, even when people try not to spread it. Within 48 hours, most of Oak Ridge Lane had heard some version of what happened at Daniel Harris's house. Some said the HOA was going after a veteran's flag. Others insisted it was just a technical violation. But regardless of interpretation, one thing was clear: people were paying attention now. And so was Daniel Harris. He didn't complain, he didn't call meetings, he didn't post anything online or go door to door. Instead, he simply adjusted his routine slightly. He still sat on his porch in the morning, still maintained his yard, still folded the flag at dusk with the same careful precision. But neighbors who watched closely noticed something different in his expression: less distance, more awareness. He knew this wasn't going away quietly. Linda Mitchell, on the other hand, saw no reason to pause. To her, the notice had been a formal step in a structured process. Issue warning, allow correction, escalate if necessary. She believed she was operating fairly, consistently, and without bias. In her mind, emotion had no place in enforcement. Rules were rules, and fairness meant applying them equally even when it was uncomfortable. So when she didn't see immediate compliance, she escalated again. A second notice was drafted. This one was more direct. It referenced a deadline for correction of non-compliant external display and warned that continued violation could result in HOA fines or further board action. Linda printed it neatly, double-checked the wording, and walked it over herself once more. Daniel was outside again when she arrived. The atmosphere felt different this time. A couple of neighbors were nearby, pretending to water plants or check mailboxes, but clearly observing. There was a quiet anticipation in the air, like people waiting for something they didn't want to happen but knew might. Linda approached with the same professional tone as before, though slightly more rigid now. "I'm following up on the previous notice," she said, holding out the paper. Daniel took it without rushing. He didn't unfold it immediately. Instead, he looked at her for a moment longer than before. "You're serious about this?" he said calmly. Linda nodded. "It's not personal, it's compliance." That word compliance hung between them. Daniel finally unfolded the notice. He read it slowly, his expression unchanged, but something subtle shifted in his posture. Not anger exactly, more like a quiet tightening, as if a boundary had been reached. "I served this country," he said after a moment, his voice steady but lower than before. "That flag isn't decoration." Linda didn't flinch, but she also didn't soften. "I respect your service," she replied, "but the HOA rules apply to everyone. We can't make exceptions or we lose structure." For the first time, Daniel gave a faint, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "It's not about structure," he said, "it's about respect." Neither of them spoke for a moment after that. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was weighted. A few neighbors who had been watching exchanged uneasy glances. One of them quietly stepped back inside. Another lingered longer than they should have, as if hoping the situation would resolve itself without escalation. Linda eventually broke the silence. "I'll give you time to correct it," she said, her tone unchanged, though slightly sharper now. "After that, I'll have to escalate it to the board." She turned and walked away before the conversation could continue. Daniel remained where he stood, holding the notice. He didn't look angry, but something in him had shifted, something quiet but firm, like a line that had been acknowledged, even if not spoken aloud. As Linda walked back down the sidewalk, she felt a sense of order restored. In her mind, she had done her job correctly. She had followed procedure. She had remained consistent. But behind her, the neighborhood felt different. People weren't just watching anymore. They were remembering. And without anyone saying it out loud, Oak Ridge Lane had begun to divide, not into sides yet, but into awareness. Because now everyone understood this wasn't going to end with a simple correction. It was going somewhere else entirely. By the time the situation reached its fourth day of escalation, Oak Ridge Lane no longer felt like the same quiet HOA community it had been just a week earlier. People still watered their lawns, cars still rolled slowly past identical mailboxes, but there was an unspoken tension in the air, subtle conversations that stopped when certain names were mentioned, and neighbors lingering a little too long when passing Daniel Harris's house. And at the center of it all was Linda Mitchell. Linda believed things were still under control. In her mind, she was simply enforcing standards that everyone had agreed to when they bought into the community. She reviewed the HOA guidelines again that morning, confident she was acting within her authority. To her, this wasn't personal. It was governance, structure, order. But she was starting to miss something important. People were no longer seeing her actions as neutral enforcement. They were seeing intent. That afternoon, she decided to return again. Not because Daniel had responded, but because he hadn't. The flag was still there, the memorial remained unchanged, and to Linda, that meant noncompliance was continuing. She printed a final notice before escalation and walked down Oak Ridge Lane with the same steady pace she always used when she felt certain of herself. A couple of neighbors noticed her and went quiet immediately. One of them pulled their child inside without a word. When she reached Daniel's home, he was not on the porch. The flag moved slightly in the breeze. The stone marker beneath it remained still as always. Linda walked up the driveway and placed the notice on the small table near the steps. She stood there for a moment as if waiting for something, maybe acknowledgement, maybe agreement. That's when Daniel appeared from the side of the house. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't startled. He simply walked into view and stopped a few feet away from her. Neither of them spoke immediately. The air felt heavier than before. "I left the notice," Linda said, breaking the silence. "This is the final step before board enforcement." Daniel looked at the paper on the table, then at her. "You keep calling it enforcement," he said quietly, "but you don't even know what that flag means." Linda held her ground. "I know what the rules say." That was the moment everything shifted. Daniel stepped slightly closer, not aggressively, but enough that the distance between them felt smaller. "For 22 years, he said, his voice still controlled but deeper now, that flag has stood for men who didn't come home, for names that don't get spoken anymore. Linda didn't respond immediately. A faint breeze moved across the yard. Then, in a moment that would later define everything, Linda looked past him at the flag again. Her expression tightened, not with understanding but with frustration, as if the meaning being attached to it was irrelevant to the system she believed she was upholding. "You're making this emotional," she said sharply. "It's not about that, it's about uniformity." And then it happened. In a sudden, dismissive motion, Linda stepped slightly forward and made a contemptuous gesture toward the ground near the memorial display. In that instant, she spat, brief, careless, and unmistakably disrespectful, right beside the flag's base. The sound wasn't loud, but everything after it went silent. Daniel didn't move. Not immediately. It was as if the entire neighborhood had stopped breathing at once. From across the street, a neighbor behind a partially opened curtain froze, their phone already in hand. Another resident stepping out of their garage stopped mid-motion. Even birds seemed to quiet in the trees overhead. Linda straightened up as if nothing had happened. "There," she said coldly, "maybe now you'll understand this is serious." But she didn't see what had just changed. Because in that single act, small in her mind, meaningless in her intent, she had crossed a line that Oak Ridge Lane would not ignore. And more importantly, she had done it in front of witnesses. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You shouldn't have done that." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't loud. But it carried a weight that made the air feel tighter than before. And for the first time, Linda Mitchell hesitated, just for a second, without fully understanding why. Because something had just been set in motion that rules, bylaws, and authority could no longer contain.